current coronavirus in different ways. So we're going to take the next 2 weeks and wrap up the school year by talking about viruses and how they came about, some of their characteristics, and so on. So before we get into viruses, just a little reminder about some of the characteristics of living things that we talked about this year. Number one is they're going to be made out of cells. They have some type of cellular organization. Viruses, remember, they're not living things. They're not going to be made out of cells. We'll talk about what they're made out of a little bit later on. All living things have to have the ability to reproduce, so to make copies of themselves if you're just one cell, or produce offspring if you're a type of animal or plant. Metabolism, all living things have to have a way to get and use energy. Homeostasis, all living things have to try to maintain a stable internal environment, things like temperature and water levels. Heredity is something else we talked about just recently, being able to pass down genes to your offspring. Responsiveness to the environment, being able to respond to stimuli. If it gets really, really hot, your body might have a way to start to cool down by like sweating, responding to different things like pain, or responding to things like running out of water, or things coming at you, being able to move, responding to the environment in some way. And then finally, growth and development. So being able to grow bigger if you're just one cell. If you're something like us, of course, we add a whole bunch of new cells to us as we grow up, and we also develop and we change a little bit. So all living things have the ability to do that. Viruses, on the other hand, they'll have the ability to do some of these, but not all of them. So they're not going to be considered a living thing. So in general, a virus is a non-living particle made up of nucleic acid and a protein coat, or a nucleic acid and a lipid protein coat. So a nucleic acid, all it is just a piece of genetic material like DNA or RNA, things that we've talked about. So a virus just has their genetic material surrounded by a protective covering. It's not a cell. It doesn't have a nucleus. It doesn't have all the other cell parts. It's just some genetic material surrounded by protein. So viruses are not living organisms, but they are of interest to biologists because they cause many diseases in living organisms, and they are useful tools for genetic research, and they are going to be active in living cells. So just think about how all of our lives have been impacted over the past few months by a very, very small non-living thing has affected all of our lives on Earth, and changed the way that we've been living. So that's why it's so important to learn about these. Not only do they impact us, there's also many viruses that impact other animals, and we'll talk about how sometimes those viruses can mutate and jump from different species, and that's when we get concerning things like viruses like the coronavirus. They're still trying to figure out exactly how it came to be, how it changed and mutated to impact humans. But we can see definitely viruses have a huge impact on our planet. So here are some reasons why viruses are considered non-living. So number one, they cannot reproduce by themselves. So viruses cannot make more of themselves without using a host cell. So they have to get inside of another organism's cells and use that cell's materials, its organelles, to make more viruses. They actually hijack the cell and then control it and make the cell make more viruses. So number two, they're not made up of cells. We've already talked about that. So they're not a living thing. They're actually much smaller than cells. And they cannot carry out metabolism by themselves. So they cannot really get and use energy all by themselves. They have to be inside of another cell. On this slide, we can see a couple examples of what viruses look like under a microscope. You can see that These ones, they have mostly a round shape, some of them kind of jagged. They have like these proteins that are up on the outside. The coronavirus looks a little bit like the first one over to the left, a little bit more round though. We'll see some more examples as we go through this, but that's the general look of viruses. But they do have, some differences between them that make one virus look different than the other. So viruses do not have cytoplasm or organelles, so they don't have that inside of a cell and they don't have cell parts. So once again, not a living thing. They depend on cells though to carry out their life, their function, if you will. They cannot carry out any cellular functions. But they do have genetic material, and that's really how they reproduce. They get inside of another cell, they inject their genetic material into that cell, and then they cause that cell to make more viruses. And actually, in these pictures here, in the middle chart of those 6 viruses, up towards the top, there's one that says coronavirus, and that's sort of what the coronavirus that's affecting us now looks like. Coronavirus is just a type of virus. There are many different coronaviruses, some that cause upper respiratory infections, and then this one that we have causes COVID-19. So coronavirus is just like a big category of viruses here on Earth. Viruses also reproduce only in living cells. So the virus is not going to split in half and make new viruses out in the wild or out in the environment. They have to get inside of other cells and reproduce. Viruses are classified according to whether they contain RNA or DNA. So their genetic material can be a little bit different. They are also classified based off of the shape of their genome and whether they have a membrane envelope that protects them. So there are some differences in the genetic material in viruses and then what surrounds the viruses on the outside, and that helps scientists classify different viruses into different categories. So here's a picture of what a typical virus is going to look like when you zoom into it. It consists of a protein coat and a nucleic acid core. And viruses a lot of them are going to have something called a capsid, which is a protein coat that surrounds some viruses. So that's a protective outer coat. You can see in the picture that the capsid is the green part on this virus, and inside of there it has nucleic acids. It has its genetic material. And that is the genetic material that's going to be injected into cells to make the cells make more viruses. So there's actually a lot to these viruses, lots of different parts to them, and this is just one example of what one could look like. So most viruses go through something called the lytic cycle. This refers to how viruses invade a host cell, produce new viruses, and then they rupture that host cell, releasing all of the newly formed viruses. This destroys the host cell that the virus entered into. So we'll take a look at a picture that walks through those steps of how viruses do this. There's also some viruses called bacteriophages, or just a phage, and this is a virus that infects bacteria. There are some viruses that just infect bacteria. They don't even infect humans or animals, but some just infect bacteria. So viruses, that's another thing that's special about them. Viruses are usually specific to what they infect. Some only infect mainly birds, some might only affect mainly mammals, some might only affect mainly bacteria or insects. So that's something that's special about them too. So here's a diagram that lays out the lytic cycle for a virus. So let's pretend that this is one of our cells. Let's say we are the host cell. And let's say that a virus is coming to attach itself to your cell. So that's what's happening in step 1. A virus is attaching itself to the cell in step 1. The thing is, the cell and the virus have to be able to stick together. So the virus has to be able to match some type of protein on the cell membrane in order to stay on it. So like not every virus can attach to every cell. Only viruses that have kind of evolved to attach to that cell are going to be able to do this. So in this step one, there's a type of virus that has been able to attach to the cell. In step two, we have the virus penetrating the cell and injecting its genetic material. So it's injecting its DNA into that cell. In step three, biosynthesis is happening. That's where cells are going to start to take that genetic material that the virus injected and use it as its own material. So they're going to start to assemble new viruses, which is actually what's happening in step four. So they're taking that genetic material, and then the cell is telling the proteins to go ahead and make more of this virus because that's the information that this cell was given. It's like putting a flash drive into a computer and using the information off of that. The cell really is just using the information that's been given to it. So it's making more viruses. And then in step five, the cell is bursting, lysing, as we might say, and it's releasing those new viruses that have been made. So even though just one virus particle came in here and it infected this cell, the cell can make dozens and dozens and probably hundreds of virus particles and release it into the rest of the body and infect more cells. So this is how just a little bit of virus can make you very sick in a small amount of time. Some viruses also follow a lysogenic cycle. So this is when the viral DNA, the virus DNA, becomes integrated into the host cell DNA. So it becomes a part of it. And then that virus can kind of hide in those host cells for a long period of time until some type of stimulus causes it to activate and then infect the cells and burst that cell. A temperate virus, this is a virus whose replication includes a lysogenic cycle. So we can see a picture down below of both the lytic cycle on the left and the lysogenic cycle on the right. The lysogenic cycle is different than the lytic cycle because the lysogenic cycle does not destroy that cell right off the bat. Actually, what happens is that genetic material from the virus gets incorporated into the DNA of the cell. And then that cell divides and then sends that genetic material to the new cells. And we make more and more cells with this viral DNA that's now a part of it. And then, later on, that viral DNA can become active and activate that virus. So this is maybe an example of a type of virus that can stay dormant in somebody for a long period of time until later on in their life it becomes active. So that's the difference there. It hides out for a while. The lytic cycle, that's going to be where the cell bursts right away after it makes those new viruses, and they go throughout the rest of the body. So some viruses are going to follow one or the other, although all viruses at the end will, if they become active, will burst that cell and infect other cells. Just another quick diagram of the lysogenic cycle here. In step one, viruses come in, they attach to the cell, they inject their DNA into that cell in step two, and then down through step three, that virus DNA becomes part of the cell's DNA, and then that cell goes through its cell cycle like we've talked about through mitosis or meiosis, and then divides, and then now those new cells have that viral DNA that's part of it. And we'll actually take a look at a video this week that talks about how all of us actually have viral DNA in ourselves that have gotten passed down through time and human evolution. So pretty cool stuff. So once again, just an overview here where we have a virus, this time infecting a bacteria cell over towards the left. The virus attaches to it, and then it injects its DNA. If it goes through the lytic cycle, that cell is going to start manufacturing and making those new viruses right away inside of the cell, and then eventually that cell will burst and release those new viruses to the environment so they can infect other cells. If it goes through the lysogenic cycle, that virus will inject its DNA, and it will become part of that cell's genetic material. And then later on, that cell could burst and release those viruses, although it would happen later on than the lytic cycle. So where did viruses come from? This is still something that is being debated by scientists. You'll be watching a video later on in classroom that will go through some of the theories. There's three big ones about where it came from. A lot of scientists think that the early viruses might have come from existing cell parts. So they think that maybe they were once a part of a cell that somehow escaped and then became its own entity, almost like a living thing, but not quite. But there are some other ideas about how viruses came to be. Some scientists think that viruses might have evolved first on Earth before living things, since viruses are so simple. And then when other living things came about, viruses were able to infect those living things. So there's lots of ideas here. We don't have for sure a certain one, but there are some really good theories out there about how they could have happened, and we'll see more of that in our video. Just another example on this slide of how viruses can look different depending on what type it is. You know, they can have lots of different looks to them, shapes. You know, some of them are round, some of them are kind of stringy, some of them are jagged and pointy. So viruses, I don't want you to think they all look a certain way. They have many different looks to them. So viruses, like we said, a lot of times they usually cause diseases. Some of the ones that affect humans and cause diseases in us include things like hepatitis, which infects the liver, causes the liver to be inflamed. SARS, which is a respiratory infection that came about in the early 2000s over in China, I believe. Shingles is another one that's actually caused by the chickenpox virus. So when you get chickenpox, a lot of people who get it, you know, you got a virus that gave you chickenpox, and then sometimes some of that virus can hide in that person's nerve cells for like decades. And then later on, when they're older, maybe in their 50s and 60s, that virus can activate and cause something called shingles, which can be very, very painful. So some other things here. The clearing of forests for housing is associated with emergences of viruses not previously seen in humans. So when we clear forests and we go into places and we start to live in places where other animals have been over a long period of time, viruses that infected those animals, they might be able to evolve to affect us and infect us. So that's something that we're seeing a lot with humans moving into areas where there weren't really humans before, but there were other wildlife, you know, insects and other types of mammals that live in these areas. So that's a concern too. And I know in places where, you know, people are really crowded together with animals, this is where viruses can maybe mutate the most because they come in contact with humans the most. So they might be able to change and infect humans, and that's something that is concerning, and that might be how viruses like the coronavirus may come to infect us in the future. So when we talk about viral spread, there are many different ways that viruses can spread. They're usually spread by vectors, and a vector is really anything that kind of spreads a virus and moves it around. They're usually living vectors. So for example, mosquitoes, they are able to carry viruses in them, you know, because they're carrying blood in them. So they might bite someone who has a virus or something that has a virus, and then they carry it to another one, another living thing. Ticks are another one. There are a couple viruses that ticks can actually carry and then give it to humans. And then, of course, humans can be vectors for the virus. And we're seeing that with the coronavirus, with, you know, telling people to socially distance because this virus is so contagious that, you know, when you get a lot of people together, the virus can spread quickly from person to person just by them breathing out or coughing or sneezing or touching things that other humans have touched. So, a lot of the viruses that infect us, humans become vectors, like the flu virus, like the coronavirus. And then we have to try to figure out, how can we mitigate this? How can we slow it down? And that's what we're doing right now with the coronavirus. And it seems to be working in a lot of areas. It seems like we're finally starting to see the numbers of virus start to drop down in this wave. So you probably hear a lot about the vaccine that we're trying to make for the coronavirus. That's because the vaccine, just like with any other virus, a vaccine is a really good bet, a really good thing to have that can help make a lot of us immune to the virus. Or at least if we get the vaccine, it would make us a stronger fighter if we would get the coronavirus. And we're really worried about individuals who are older and have underlying health conditions. So those are the ones we're concerned about the most because that's who the virus seems to be impacting the most. So we're doing a lot of work to get a vaccine. Hopefully, in the next year, we will have a functioning vaccine to help protect ourselves against the coronavirus, just like we help protect ourselves against the flu virus and other types of viruses. Antibiotics, you hear a lot about those. Those are ineffective against viruses because antibodies interfere with cellular processes that viruses do not perform. Antibiotics, I should say, they do something different. They help to uh, kill off bacteria, which is a living thing and which is a cell. So antibiotics, they help to burst those cells and interfere with those bacteria cells. Remember, a virus is not a bacteria. A virus is not a cell. So antibiotics, they're not really going to do much for the virus. They might help treat some symptoms sometimes, but we don't have much research to show that either. So vaccines are really the one thing we have to combat viruses. Vaccination and vector control have been most successful at fighting viral diseases. So anytime that we have a virus outbreak, a flu outbreak, or this COVID-19 outbreak, studies have shown that if you're able to control the vector, that means control the thing that's spreading the virus. In this case, it's us. If you're able to, control the movement of that and, have people be separated, that's one thing that can slow the spread of that virus. And we're seeing that it is working. And then the vaccine, as long as we get a good vaccine, that's something that will allow us all to have some protection against that virus. We'll get it, we'll get the vaccination, we'll be able to have a stronger immune response to that virus if we were to get it. So it helps us fight that virus off a lot better than if we had no vaccine. So that's kind of the situation we're in now. Hopefully this gives you a little bit more of an understanding of what a virus is, why it's not a living thing, and why we're doing some of the steps we're doing to slow the spread of it and also to come up with a vaccine so that this virus is not something we have to worry about as much in the future.